welcome to the Athlete's Edge podcast. So let's get started for today's episode. Tim, most athletes love the gym, but a common problem when we talk to athletes in the gym about what they have been doing, too many of them train like bodybuilders and then wonder why they're slow, stiff, or always breaking down. So why is bodybuilding style training such a trap for athletes?
To me, so a little bit about our chat that we've mentioned before about CrossFit. So bodybuilding for bodybuilding athletes is a sport in itself. And it's a sport where it's about looking good. So building big muscles, being really, really lean. So within that comes some challenges that those athletes face. But for our athletes, if we take too much of that and that style of training, a lot of isolated movements, more focused on the muscle itself and not, when we talk sports performance, very much around speed, power, durability, coordination. They don't need to go out and run around and change direction and jump and land and whatnot. Like I said, they're just focused on big, strong muscles that look good when they're up on stage. So the challenge is having big muscles and looking a certain way doesn't transfer to performance. Bigger muscles can be helpful for force generation, but don't guarantee that force transfers to athletic movements. So in bodybuilding, they often talk about chasing that burn or that pump because that feels good and they know that the target muscle is probably working. But for our athletes, we want to chase what transfers to sport.
So if we dig into the difference between that kind of hypertrophy training, which is associated with that kind of bodybuilder type training,
Yep.
and the difference between that and performance, why doesn't muscle size automatically equal sporting success? You already touched on it a little bit there with the negative transfer. So Can you sort of dive a bit deeper into that?
Well, hypertrophy or bigger muscles comes about because we develop a bigger cross-sectional area of a specific muscle, which for bodybuilders, obviously is the goal because it looks bigger. So a bigger muscle will, have a potential to produce more force when it contracts, which can be a good thing in some instances, but there's more to just producing force. So for example, not only how much force you can produce, but how quickly can you produce it. And we know the bigger muscle and the bigger contraction, rate of force development, so the speed at which you can produce the force goes down. So there's a challenge there when we need to produce force quickly. Movement is also very much skill-based, as most athletes will know. So not always do you need to be big, but coordination really helps. And that's within the one muscle, but how a lot of those muscles work together. So if you're neglecting the skill component, you can be as big and strong as you want, but you're still not going to move really well, and you're not going to see that transfer on the field. To me, like a good example, you can have 100 kilo bodybuilder, someone the same size, even lighter as like a sprinter, who's going to move better. And I think we can all relate to that sprinter looking really good. And the difference is, it's any strength and muscle they've developed, it's very much functional. So they can use everything they've got for sprinting, for jumping, for changing direction, all those sort of things. So, like I said, that comes back to like the neural recruitment, how you coordinate which muscles need to contract, but also which ones relax. And if you're doing lots of heavy stuff and pump, you get kind of tired and you get really good at squeezing things and contracting, but you don't get necessarily great at relaxing. We've experienced that with our gym stuff. The other thing to remember too is every exercise has a specific transfer to it. So for example, if we think of a squat, we know squats are hardest at the bottom of the movement. That's where if you're going to get stuck, you're going to get stuck down there. So the strength transfer for that movement is a lot more specific to those deeper positions. Now in the sprinter example, they're never in those positions other than the first 2 steps, 3 steps out of the blocks. So yes, being stronger in a squat might have some transfer to your start, so like the initial 5 meter acceleration, but what we know is post 5-10 meters, there's not much correlation between being really strong in a squat and your top end speed. And it just comes back to joint angles, muscle lengths, which muscles are doing the movement, things like coordination. So again, you've got to understand, and that's why our programs have a wide range of exercises, from deep positions, because at times they're going to need it, so like a ground ball in footy, but there's a lot of times they're upright and they got to jump, and land in fairly straight positions. So we do a lot of isometric work and work in those positions too. So everything transfer comes down to a lot of different variables. It's really complex, but basically, if we only train a certain way, then we're only going to have a transfer, I guess, that comes from the specific training positions and muscles we use.
And why do athletes often think those heavy lifts like squats, deadlifts, or the high rep sets and volumes will make them faster?
I think because it's hard. I think most people think if you're doing something hard, it's good for you. I think the same with running volume discussions we've had. I think if it's tiring, it's really hard, it must be helping. And to a point, and in beginners, probably. But after a certain point, when you start to no longer a beginner, transfer and continual improvements get tougher. So we know sport, especially at a higher level, is about fast, high intent actions, which means you need fast, high intent contractions. So you need your muscles to back that up. So your high rep, your slow movements, your isolated lifts, aren't really going to help your sprint mechanics or your jumping, producing force quickly. We need, yes, some strength work, absolutely, because stronger muscles will help, but it needs to be complemented with plyometrics, with isometrics, with our speed work. We need to be running and transferring what we've developed into the actual, I guess, sport itself. So if you want to get fast, you have to sprint.
Another thing you've talked about before is fatigue and the effect that the bodybuilding style workouts with the high reps and volume style training can actually interfere with performance work. So talk to us about the effect that fatigue can have.
Well, to build muscle and a significant amount of it without extra substances to help, like steroids, it takes a lot of work, a lot of hard training, and that's where things like the upper body splits or the chest and the back splits and all that sort of stuff come in a bodybuilding type program. That's because they don't have to worry about sport training 3 times a week and extra conditioning and skill work and all this sort of stuff. So the harder you train and the closer to failure you get, the longer that fatigue from that session lasts. And that doesn't matter if it's upper body, that there's an element of like a system neural fatigue that affects the whole body. So even if you do only an upper body workout, but you go really hard to failure and you do it for 45 minutes, you will see some fatigue still exist in your lower body, so like a jump test for 2 to 3 days, potentially post. So the problem with, training hard every day and backing up, trying to build muscle, even if you're doing upper, lower splits, or like I said, focusing on specific muscle groups, there's still a system fatigue. So there's still a cost to that that makes athletes like performance drop, especially those high intensity actions, as well as soreness and stiffness and all that sort of stuff, which obviously makes certain training hard.
I know you're a big fan of Mike Boyle and some of his work that he does in the States.
Yep.
He's obviously, one of the world's best high performance trainers out there, and he often says, train movements, not muscles. So how can athletes apply that, and what does that mean for athletes?
Well, our biggest challenge with athletes is we've got 2 to 3 sessions a week for the most part. So if we went down to really focused, isolated exercise, we'd run out of time to get, pretty much scratch the surface, let alone to get really deep into a good program. Because sport is multi-directional. There's lots of decelerations, change of directions. You're doing a lot of stuff on one leg. There's sprinting. There's from an upright position. There's sprinting from a low position. There's lots of things to consider. There's throwing. There's twisting. There's tackling, or contact work. So there's lots of things to try and train in a program that, even in a full-time program, you got to leave a lot of stuff out. So we can't afford to just work in isolation, because that's not going to really prepare the joints for the chaos that the game will demand. We're going to need a lot of like single leg strength, eccentric control. We need mobility in there. So for me, it's very much a movement first approach. Yes, there will be some isolated work, almost as accessory work to complement that, but we need to make sure we're really filling the big buckets first, and then only filling up when we've got time in and around that, which just means that, that bodybuilding style training just doesn't have a place for us.
So what should athletes be doing instead? What should they be prioritising instead of that bodybuilding style?
Well, we risk sort of going into silos too much, but I think if we sort of use these terms a little bit to help simplify it. So for me, strength work, so yes, we want to get stronger, but it's typically a bit more lower rep. It's high intent compound lifts. So we're sort of talking multi-joint lifts, and where we can for us, we're doing like a single leg focus. So whether a true single leg or more like a split or staggered stance exercise, so that we sort of getting some stability component to it at the same time. We've got power work, so we're doing plyometrics, we're doing med ball throws, some Olympic lift variations. Again, low volume, high intent. So already there's a big difference there to the bodybuilding type stuff where it's sort of lower, moderate intent, but high volume. We've got to have speed work in there, so like actually sprinting in our program once or twice a week, as well as a lot of technique work. So our athletes will know that we do, switching, a lot of that sort of stuff in our actual activation work in our gym sessions, just to get more exposure to it, so that we're constantly reinforcing the good techniques we want to see. We're working through multiple planes, so not just forward back, we're side to side, we're working in rotation. There's some eccentric stuff where it's not just about, just falling down and then everything about the push up, which is that pump feeling. We want to control our body position. We want to make sure that we're preparing ourselves for a lot of those braking movements or landing actions that actually more often cause injuries than the opposite. And then how we, put it all together. So how you build that out from week 1 to week 5 of our training blocks, how each block builds on that in season versus off season, so that we're building, we're converting, and we're maintaining the performance we see. We're not just constant high volume, build big muscles.
And so if there's one key takeaway from this episode, what should athletes remember about training like a bodybuilder versus training like an athlete?
Well, I've got a few. I guess one thing to wrap it up would be, if you want to look good, train like a bodybuilder. If you want to perform, you train like an athlete. So bodybuilding is very much about size and obviously your physique and the looks. It's not about being explosive, being fast. Athletes do need some strength, but the speed to get faster, you got to think about that middle ground and how you transfer that. So don't fall in the trap of chasing just what feels good or feels hard, gives you the pump, you look in the mirror, this must be working. You got to obviously remember, train for what matters. A lot of the time that is things that we're not necessarily good at. It's, training our weaknesses as well. Yes, we want to get strong and powerful, but we've got to remember it's part of a well-rounded program, so that transfers to the field.